History as it happens, April 20th, 2023. The Daniloff Affair.
Recently, after the arrest of a Soviet national and UN employee accused of espionage in the United States, an American correspondent in Moscow was made the subject of fabricated accusations and trumped-up charges.
We are so relieved and happy that Mr. Daniloff is out of that 8 by 10 foot cell which he was sharing with someone we think was an informant.
And if it hadn't been for President Reagan's taking a very deep and personal interest in my case, it would probably be some years before I could stand in front of you.
Russian security agents arrest an American journalist. They charge him with espionage and lock him away. It sparks an international outcry as U.S. leaders demand his release. This is what happened to the Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich. It's also what happened in 1986 to Nicholas Daniloff. The difference, U.S.-Russian relations may have been better then, during the Cold War, than today. And that's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Russia's security agency says it has arrested a U.S. journalist working for the Wall Street Journal in Moscow.
An accusation of spying for the U.S. And just hours ago, a Moscow court ordered him to be held until at least the 29th of May.
The charges against Evan are baseless, and we call on the Russian Federation to immediately release him. We also call for the immediate release of Paul Whelan. Paul has been held more than 4 years in Russia. Both men deserve to go home to their families now.
Nicholas Daniloff is an innocent hostage who should be released. The Soviet Union bears the responsibility for the consequences of its action.
In late summer 1986, the KGB detained Nicholas Daniloff, a reporter for U.S. News and World Report, a man Mikhail Gorbachev would later call a spy caught red-handed. Daniloff had been handed a package by a Soviet acquaintance containing documents marked top secret. He turned them over to the U.S. Embassy. What Daniloff did not know was that a CIA case officer at the embassy had contacted a possible Russian source of the documents, a source who happened to work for the KGB. And the CIA guy named Daniloff as the intermediary. Oops. As historian William Inboden writes, the KGB now had what it needed, the name of a journalist who passed classified documents to the CIA, and they waited for an opportune time to swoop in and make Daniloff a hostage. Now, Nicholas Daniloff was not a spy, but the CIA really screwed up, and now the Reagan administration had a real problem on its hands. An American journalist facing a potentially long prison sentence, wrongly accused of espionage, as the White House was trying to arrange the next Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Iceland. Daniloff's fate was so important to Reagan that the president brought it up as a major human rights offense committed by the Soviet Union in a speech to the UN on September 22, 1986, a speech about the importance of negotiating nuclear arms reductions and improving overall U.S.-Soviet relations.
I would also like to address other essential steps toward peace: the resolution of political conflicts, the strengthening of the international economy, and the protection of human rights. Before I do this, however, let me, in the tradition of candor established at Geneva, tell you what a pall has been cast over our relations with the Soviet Union. I refer here to a particularly disturbing example of Soviet transgressions against human rights. Recently, after the arrest of a Soviet national and UN employee accused of espionage in the United States, an American correspondent in Moscow was made the subject of fabricated accusations and trumped-up charges. He was arrested and jailed in a callous disregard of due process and numerous human rights conventions.
By the end of the month, a deal was reached to swap prisoners, and the summit in Reykjavik could now take place. More on that in a bit. On October 1st, Daniloff visited the White House. This is from the AP archive.
Hello there. Nice to see you.
Mr. President, it was a great day. Well, wonderful day. And I know that you took a very deep personal interest in my case, and I think
those who say that you caved in to Gorbachev.
I don't think there was any caving in at all.
Why not?
Because no one had to cave in.
Well, didn't you agree to this meeting in Iceland as part of the effort to get Daniloff free?
No. I just said that there wouldn't be any meeting until he was free.
I'd like to add one thing, if I may, and that is this was a very complex situation, and if it hadn't been for President Reagan's taking a very deep and personal interest in my case, it would probably be some years before I could stand in front of you and say thank you, Mr. President.
I thought of the Daniloff Affair when news broke that Russian security agents arrested the Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich and accused him of spying. U.S. Ambassador to Russia Lynn Tracy visited the journalist in prison, and she says the charges are, of course, baseless.
I was able to meet Evan yesterday at Lefort prison. It was the first time we were granted consular access since his wrongful detention more than 2 weeks ago. I can report that he is in good health and remains strong despite his circumstances. We will continue to provide all appropriate support to Evan and his family, and we expect Russian authorities to provide continued consular access to Evan. The charges against Evan are baseless, and we call on the Russian Federation to immediately release him.
The Biden administration did arrange a prisoner swap to free Brittany Griner, the pro basketball player who spent 10 months jailed in Russia on drug charges. But this case may be different. Gershkovich is a reporter, and he's accused of espionage. That's about as serious an allegation there is. During the Daniloff Affair, Reagan personally wrote Gorbachev to tell him the American was no spy. The two leaders were building trust at that point in their relationship. But today, it seems hard to imagine President Biden giving Putin a call about Gershkovich. Who knows? Maybe, hopefully, he'll be released as soon as possible. But U.S. Russia relations are in ruins nowadays. Simon Miles is a diplomatic historian at Duke, and he is the author of Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginning of the End of the Cold War. That book explores the root causes of cooperation between two adversarial states. And that happens to be a very timely subject, given what's going on with Evan Gershkovich and what we're going to discuss here. Simon Miles, hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
So because I spend most of my time thinking about recent decades, I immediately thought of the Daniloff Affair when I saw the news about the Wall Street Journal reporter. Did you also think about Nicholas Daniloff?
I think a lot of people's minds went to the Daniloff case from '86 when they heard that Evan Gershkovich had been arrested in Yekaterinburg by the FSB. It's a sort of a natural parallel between the current and former journalists who were arrested with, really no cause and on trumped up charges by the Russian security services. And obviously it's on the minds of folks at the Journal who very soon after actually ran an op-ed by Daniloff about being arrested then by the KGB in the Soviet Union and have sort of drawn that parallel themselves. So I think it's a natural place, Martin, that people's minds are going.
One major difference, and we will get to this, but I just want to introduce it briefly now, is the state of U.S. Russia relations. It is ironic that they were better during the Cold War, at least 1986, than they are today. So just some context then. What was the Cold War like in 1986 when it came to how the U.S. and Russia were getting along?
Well, by 1986, you had a few really important changes in U.S.-Soviet relations. The first of those was in the Kremlin. You had a very new, very different Soviet leader in Mikhail Gorbachev, who I would argue never abandoned his belief in communism, nor even really abandoned a traditional skepticism of the United States, but frankly saw that he had little to no choice but to work more closely with the United States in sort of doing deals which more and more favored Washington at Moscow's expense in order to manage the extraordinarily turbulent processes underway in the Soviet Union itself. In Russian, these were called glasnost and perestroika, which translate roughly, respectively, to openness, that is political openness, and restructuring, that is economic restructuring. So Gorbachev ushers in major changes and really changes the tone of life by 1986 in the Soviet Union. The second factor is how Ronald Reagan is behaving. So when Reagan is first elected in 1980, he basically runs on an extremely pessimistic platform. He runs on a platform of, we're losing the Cold War. By 1986, after 4+ years of major investments in the U.S. military and defense industrial complex, after the growing pains of globalization smooth out a little bit, incidentally, the United States much better poised to take advantage of globalization than is the quasi-autarky that is the Soviet Union. So Reagan is sort of newly emboldened to overtly, as opposed to covertly back channel, engage with the Soviet Union by 86. And so your question actually did a little question begging, which was that relations were vastly better in 1986 than they are now in 2023. And I think I would probably still endorse that basic claim, but I think that a lot of this is understanding the surface level, the almost superficial political element, and then understanding what's going on behind the scenes. And if we drill down into the background of what's going on between Washington and Moscow in 86, it's not as bad as today, but it's certainly not the sort of halcyon days of U.S.-Soviet cooperation and friendship that I think it's kind of been built up to be of late.
Yeah, the two leaders had a good rapport, but the nations were still pointing nuclear missiles at each other. The United States was fighting a proxy war or was backing the resistance in Afghanistan in that war that had been going on a long time. And in 83, Reagan had called the Soviet Empire or the Soviet Union an evil empire. So
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
But I think you're right. By 86, there is more of a thaw. And then in August of that year, well, let me just backtrack. 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev have their first summit. How important was that first summit before we get back to 86 here?
I think the November 1985 summit between Reagan and Gorbachev in Geneva, Switzerland, was hugely important because it humanized the one for the other. And both sides of the Cold War in that period of time in the early 1980s had sort of forgotten about that interpersonal element. They came to really kind of overly inflate the hostility of the other side, the fundamental hostility, in a way that just talking chipped away at.
Just suppose with me for a moment that an Ivan and an Anya could find themselves, say, in a waiting room or sharing a shelter from the rain or a storm with a Jim and Sally. And there was no language barrier to keep them from getting acquainted. Would they then debate the differences between their respective governments? Or would they find themselves comparing notes about their children?
Now, Reagan and Gorbachev didn't leave Geneva in 1985 the best of friends, but they did leave Geneva in 85 with a sense of two important things. One, that they actually could do deals with one another, that there was a basic trustworthiness and kind of good faith element present in their counterparty that would make it possible to negotiate. This is the basic trust that's required to enter into negotiations, not much deeper than that. But also they left with a sense that actually there were some issues on which they did have some overlapping interest. So both Reagan and Gorbachev were really fixated on the threat of nuclear weapons. Reagan many, many times said that he wanted to live in a world free of nuclear weapons. In fact, the speech you referenced, the early 1983 speech to the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando, the evil empire line gets all the quotations, right? 2 paragraphs, I think, later, Reagan talks about living in, God willing, a world free of the scourge of nuclear weapons.
While we negotiate real and verifiable reductions in the world's nuclear arsenals, and one day, with God's help, their total elimination.
So this is a big part of his worldview. And Gorbachev in 85 is already pretty skeptical of mutually assured destruction. And after the disaster at Chernobyl about a year later, he's even more emphatic about the importance of getting rid of these weapons.
Both of these men were committed to de-escalating the Cold War. So, August 1986, the FBI arrests a Soviet citizen at the UN. Who was Gennady Zakharov?
Gennady Zakharov was a Soviet physicist who was part of the UN staff, and he was basically caught up in a sting operation by the FBI, who used a fake student to build a relationship. Said fake student then got a job at a defense contractor and sold Zakharov the plans for U.S. warplanes, I believe it was engines, for some sort of nominal sum of money. And so Zakharov was basically caught up in this sting and was arrested by the FBI after taking receipt of this package of classified documents from the person pretending to be a pro-Soviet, or at least pro-Soviet, if the cash was right, spy. And so Zakharov gets arrested, tried, convicted, and this becomes, a major thorn in the side of what you and I have talked about, which is this improving relationship between the superpowers.
Do we know if Zakharov was a spy? I mean, Reagan said he was engaged in espionage in a speech he gave to the UN shortly after this. I'll get to that in a little bit. But do we know for a fact that he was engaged in espionage?
Yeah, he took receipt of classified materials from someone he believed had legitimate access to them and traded that for money. That's more or less a textbook case of espionage.
And the Russians had a history of having spies at the UN and elsewhere in the United States, obviously.
Absolutely. And to be fair to Zakharov, any American in Moscow who was in the right position to do so would, I'm sure, have been only too happy to do exactly that. In fact, we know many stories of Soviet scientists who did exactly that in exchange for various compensation from the United States. That's kind of just the game of espionage.
That's right. So people might be wondering, Martin, you're supposed to be talking about the Daniloff Affair. Why in the world are you talking about this guy Zakharov, who no one remembers his name, from 1986? Well, he was arrested, Zakharov was, on August 23rd. August 30th, the KGB arrests a reporter for U.S. News and World Report named Nicholas Daniloff, who is still with us. He is 88. I think you mentioned he wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal about his case recently. Let's just start with this. Why was this so shocking? Obviously, alleged spies had been arrested in Russia many times before, but this was a reporter we're talking about.
I think the shock stemmed from a few things. One was the, let's say, pretty shamelessly transparent tit-for-tat nature of what was going on. Zakharov is arrested, a couple weeks pass, and Daniloff is arrested. It's fairly clear what's going on there. In fact, much later on at a conference at Harvard University, Daniloff was in the audience and Mikhail Gorbachev was behind the lectern. And Daniloff asks Gorbachev about his own case. Gorbachev says, it was basically just a case of Cold War tit for tat. And that was at odds. That was at odds with the public image that Gorbachev was working very hard to cultivate around the world as being sort of, how can I put this, almost better than that level of crass tit-for-tat gamesmanship.
I never knew that story. Sorry to interject, but in September of 86, Gorbachev said Daniloff was a spy caught red-handed.
Yeah. Gorbachev has certainly since recanted that. He's since said, that this was just classic Cold War tit-for-tat, and he said it not only in public, but he said it to Daniloff's face. So that's sort of the first element that I think really was striking to people at the time. The second element that was really striking to people at the time was that you've got this whole project of glasnost in the Gorbachev-era Soviet Union that's about transparency, that's about opening up what it's okay to talk about in life in the Soviet Union. So things like, for example, Stalin's purges, are now being not only acknowledged by the state, but also a conversation is allowed to start about what those meant and what the relationship between the system of government, which was still in place in Moscow, was, and those types of gross abuses of basic human decency, to be frank. So this is very much at odds with Gorbachev's image that he's working hard to cultivate as a liberalizer and the stated objectives of this project within the country. And then you're arresting journalists. That's a really tough circle to square. And it led many people, frankly, in the United States and the Soviet Union, to wonder, is this all just a sham? So many people in the USSR at this time thought that this relaxation of social control was intended actually as bait, to lure the dissidents, to lure the people who thought the wrong thing, who were politically unreliable out, and then to effectively lock up that segment of society, eliminate it from the public sphere to keep only passive, accepting, loyal people in play. That persists until basically the Soviet Union falls apart. There's a segment of Soviet society that never really thinks this is for real, and locking up journalists feeds that flame.
And the KGB didn't learn about Daniloff on August 29th and then arrest him on the 30th. They were on to him. And I want to have you go into this a little bit here. I'm holding William Inboden's book, The Peacemaker, about the Reagan years. He has a couple of pages in this long book dedicated to Daniloff. Reagan had sent a letter to Gorbachev saying, hey, this guy is not a spy. But Reagan did not know when he sent that letter that Daniloff actually did have an oblique connection to the CIA. Twice during the previous 5 years, mysterious envelopes had been given to Daniloff addressed to the U.S. government. Daniloff had turned them over to the U.S. Embassy, where the CIA station determined that the envelopes contained top-secret documents on Soviet ballistic missiles. So why don't you pick it up from there, Simon, and tell me how this wound up getting Daniloff arrested for alleged espionage?
Well, the first big question is whether those materials were actually the product of someone who wanted to give secrets to the United States, or whether it was part of some kind of intelligence operation in and of itself. Maybe this was as simple as an attempt to implicate Daniloff in espionage in order to use him in this type of activity.
That's
or
right. Set a trap, right? Setting a trap. So
set a trap.
Arrest him and then trade him for one of our guys who gets arrested.
Yeah, with materials that look pretty good, but maybe have, and this was part of the conversation at the time, that have some pretty important details that are missing, and maybe actually, honestly, are by and large already known by the United States, who can gather this information through things like technical means and other forms of access to that type of information. So Daniloff had been part of this activity unwittingly. He then made the decision, which is not the decision that everyone who received that type of material made, to pass it on to the United States. Because some U.S. government, some journalists we know received these types of mysterious packages which looked juicy and kept them for themselves, or destroyed them because they didn't want them to be used against them. And so Daniloff makes the choice to hand them over to the U.S. Embassy, and also gives his counterparts there some indication of what he thinks is the source of those materials. Then the CIA has some operational security problems. And the name Daniloff is picked up in intercepts pertaining to these materials. If the materials were indeed sincerely given as an attempt to provide secret information to the United States, then Daniloff becomes implicated.
So the CIA mentioned his name to a Russian intermediary, or named Daniloff as the intermediary.
Right. They mentioned Daniloff's name, and so this ties him to the affair, whether that's either further ammunition for the sting operation, or he's now drawn into this.
A bad mistake by the CIA, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, this is a massive operational security failure. But it's important to remember, I think, that the distinction between spy and journalist that you and I are basically assuming in this conversation right now didn't really meaningfully exist all that much for the Soviet Union. And there's a kernel of truth to this. The methods that a good news reporter and a good intelligence officer are going to use really only differ in terms of what their final product is, in terms of how you do it, and oftentimes why you do it. A lot of these folks are just motivated by some kind of innate curiosity that ticks within them. We can talk about this like there's this clear chasm between being a spy and being a reporter. And that's because, more because of our sort of moral code and worldview than it is about the basic mechanisms of what these two types of people do. And certainly in the eyes of the Soviet Union, which was extremely sensitive to intelligence issues, but also to the threat of popular dissatisfaction, a lot of what Daniloff was up to seemed completely indistinguishable from what an actual spy would do. The Soviets knew that the law in the United States in the late 70s, after the Church Committee had prohibited the use of reporters in espionage, but they also probably would be the first to say, that's what they say. They don't actually mean that. In fact, maybe they're just trying to throw us off the scent.
That's right. There was paranoia there. And as you mentioned at the top of the discussion, we shouldn't make too much of the thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations at this point. There was still a lot of mistrust or distrust, which is the right word there. So Reagan and the United States, how do they react once they learn that Daniloff has been arrested?
Well, there's an initial resistance to making too much of a thing out of Daniloff. Reagan had campaigned actually against the policies that Carter had implemented, Jimmy Carter, his predecessor in the White House, that Reagan thought kind of subordinated the needs of the state to the individual, which, if you think about this in the context of the Cold War, is really ironic, because the whole Cold War was kind of, on an ideological level, was about whether it was appropriate to subordinate the individual to the needs of the state. And Reagan was kind of making the case that mirrored the Soviets in a macro sense about this micro case of Nicholas Daniloff. So initially, the administration kind of wants to keep this at arm's length, not let this derail what, as we've talked about already, looks like it could be a fruitful, budding relationship with the Soviet leader. But it's actually George Shultz, who's the Secretary of State, who really pushes the issue to recognize that, it's easy in a campaign to say, oh, this is just one individual. If an arms control agreement is worth doing, it's worth doing, even if this one individual is in a bad way. And I think Reagan is a receptive audience to Shultz's case. And so Shultz and his Soviet counterpart, Edward Shevardnadze, negotiate basically this swap.
And complicating matters was the fact that Reagan and Shultz in the White House, they couldn't say publicly that the CIA screwed up here, right?
Of course not. That would be a really big issue. But I think that one of the things that tips the scales in Reagan's thinking is when he is told that actually there is a role that the U.S. government has played in here, which it would seem was not a helpful one.
And before this is resolved, it's possible that Daniloff could be sent away maybe for the rest of his life, right? I mean, that's a legitimate fear at this early stage in the crisis, right?
Of course, and no one knows at this point that the Soviet Union is going to collapse in 5 years.
That's right.
No one knows how far Gorbachev's reforms are going to go in terms of releasing political prisoners, political exiles, and things like that. So the worst case scenarios are pretty dire. The Soviet penal system, like the Russian penal system today, is a brutal apparatus.
So September 22nd, 1986, President Ronald Reagan delivers a speech at the UN in which he mentions Daniloff by name.
I refer here to a particularly disturbing example of Soviet transgressions against human rights. Recently, after the arrest of a Soviet national and UN employee accused of espionage in the United States, an American correspondent in Moscow was made the subject of fabricated accusations and trumped-up charges. He was arrested and jailed in a callous disregard of due process and numerous human rights conventions. In effect, he was taken as a hostage, even threatened with the death penalty. Both individuals have now been remanded to their respective ambassadors. But this is only an interim step agreed to by the United States for humanitarian reasons. It does not change the facts of the case. Gennady Zakharov is an accused spy who would stand trial. Nicholas Daniloff is an innocent hostage who should be released.
Something else is going on in the background, right? The Soviets and the U.S. are talking about another summit. And how does that interact with the negotiations to free Daniloff?
Well, essentially, the threat is made that if there's no progress on the Daniloff issue, there's not going to be progress on any of the other issues that are cooking away. Basically, every year after he takes power in early 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev is more and more and more dependent on progress in the international sphere, in getting agreements, big marquee agreements with pomp and circumstance signing ceremonies. That's really the only place that he can actually get wins by late in his time as first general secretary, and then they changed the name to president of the Soviet Union. And so the threat of derailing this process is actually a pretty credible one to a general secretary whose situation at home is really just going from bad to worse and is dependent on the public goodwill generated from representing the Soviet Union abroad in order to maintain his situation.
That's pretty amazing what you just said there, that if Daniloff were not let go, Reagan and Gorbachev might never have met in Iceland, a summit where they came really close to agreeing to abolish their nuclear weapons. But, it's hard to imagine something like that happening today, right? When Brittany Griner, who was not charged with espionage, but was still held unjustly in Russia, President Biden saying to Putin, we're not doing anything until we resolve this. And now with this Wall Street Journal reporter. But that's because the relationship today between the two countries is almost non-existent, wouldn't you say?
Relationship is actually very existent. It's just not existent between the people who are the most public and at the top of the sphere. Even during the worst days of the Cold War, there was so much constant contact between military professionals, civil servants, and diplomats. Right. And that's just not something that we see. That's true today. That was true then. Most of that is highly routine. And I'm not saying that these are all friendly interactions, but they are an important sort of multi-vector pathway of communication between Washington and Moscow. So yes, Biden and Putin are not talking very much. And in large part, that's because it's perceived by both that this is not just a practical activity, but a political act. Right? To have a meeting with the president of Russia, if you're Joe Biden, many would say, is to legitimize what Russian foreign policy is doing right now, including but not limited to the illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's no relationship, because most of the relationships between countries take place at a level that we just don't really hear about. They're not, It's not being done by people who make the news or are in the news. It's being done by people who are charged with the day-to-day management of foreign policy. And it's an unglamorous and often thankless job. But those are the people whom we have to thank for keeping things going in important relationships like this one.
But there's not a lot of communication at the top levels of government right now. For instance, the U.S. Defense Secretary only recently, or was it the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, only recently spoke to his counterpart on the Russian side, maybe for one of the first times since the war in Ukraine began. There's not a lot of trust. There's not a lot of good faith right here to try to affect something like the release of this Wall Street Journal reporter.
That's right. There's not a lot of assumption of good faith. But I think there is also an understanding that sometimes there are overlapping interests. And that, at the end of the day, is what most of international politics is about. I think right now what the Kremlin is trying to do is to see how much they can get away with when it comes to the United States. What happened to Evan Gershkovich can be seen as part of a trajectory, which obviously began with the invasion of Ukraine. And I think it was a real mistake on the part of the Biden administration to essentially forswear trying to stop the invasion from happening. Right? There's a really clear message being sent very early on in sort of late 2021 and then early 2022, where the United States almost abandons the hope of trying to get the Kremlin to stop and instead just starts talking about what they're going to do when this thing happens, not if it happens. Fast forward to just a few weeks ago, practically, when a Russian jet takes down a U.S. unmanned aerial vehicle flying in international airspace over the Black Sea. What repercussions did the United States impose on the Russians for that act of aggression and unprofessionalism? Best I can see, none. And so it seems like they're escalating yet further to see what cost they'll have to pay now for arresting a U.S. citizen who's an accredited journalist.
One other point about Daniloff and his release. So it was finally agreed to on September 28th, 1986, when Shultz and Shevardnadze had a really long meeting late into the night, and they finally agreed to resolve all of this. And the Soviets also agreed to release a dissident, Yuri Orlov, I believe his name was. In exchange, I believe Zakharov is released by the U.S., right?
Right.
And right-wingers in the U.S. weren't too happy about that. They beat up on Reagan for, well, I mean, I guess they had a point, right? The Soviets took a hostage and they got one of theirs in return.
You know, one of the really understood stories about the Reagan administration is the extent to which, you know, for decades after he was president, he kind of became the avatar of conservatism in the United States. But for the 8 years of his presidency, he was taking a beating from conservatives in the United States. Newt Gingrich compares him to Neville Chamberlain going to meet Adolf Hitler after Geneva in 1985, which we talked about a while ago. So Reagan is really taking a beating from both sides. And of course, on the Daniloff affair, those who had been critical of his foreign policy on many other points see an opportunity. These are Republicans who have been critical of his foreign policy, see another opportunity to let loose the slings and arrows. But to get to the basic point that you're making, at the end of the day, an American who is unjustly held comes home. I think that's a win. And I thought that was true with Brittany Griner, who was held over what appears to have been an unfortunate but real mistake when she was traded for someone who has an extraordinary quantity of blood on his hands from being in the arms business. There were many who said, that was wrong. At the end of the day, an American comes home. It's hard to be a spy and it's hard to be an arms dealer, speaking here about both cases, when you've had your face all over the newspapers. Success in those businesses is premised on discretion. And so even if these people are out of prison, they're effectively neutralized as threats in their respective lines of activity.
Well, it's very easy to criticize when you're not in charge and you're not the one responsible for trying to bring somebody home. Reagan did expel back to Moscow another 25 KGB officers who are masquerading, as William Inboden writes, as UN diplomats around the same time that Shultz was negotiating with the Soviets to get Daniloff home. Final question for you, Simon Miles. We're bouncing back and forth between past and present here, but that's all right. Back to present day, a subject of so many of my podcasts over the past year plus. What has caused the breakdown in the relationship between the U.S. and Russia? It's a huge question, right? We're talking about 30 years of history. Some have argued that Russian leaders have chosen not to have an open society. They turned away from democracy. And evidence of that is, well, they're still arresting American journalists who aren't spies.
That's a pretty big question, Martins, but I'm going to try to give you the top line.
Yeah, that's fine.
Version, because we could do a whole other podcast on my thoughts on this, as opposed to on Nicholas Daniloff and Evan Gershkovich, who hopefully will be free soon and back home. I think the basic issue is the same issue that any dispute boils down to, and that is a fundamental incompatibility of interests. The Russian Federation, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, wanted to preserve the influence, the international influence that the Soviet Union had enjoyed, while still getting rid of the political system that made the Soviet Union basically what it was. That influence included a preponderant role in what the Russians call their near abroad. So this would be the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, the Baltic states, Belarus, the Stans. That included calling the shots to a certain extent when it came to European security, even though there were sovereign states in Europe who had their own ideas about how their security could be best provided for. And the answer to that question was not Moscow, it was NATO, it was Brussels, and frankly, Washington. So the years after the Cold War are brutal years in Russia. The 1990s are turbulent, terrible years for the vast majority of people. And so dissatisfaction with democracy isn't invented by people like Vladimir Putin. When he talks about the perils and pitfalls of democratic governance, there are many Russians who have experienced that firsthand during the 1990s, who saw their lives get worse as their political system got, according to our standards, better. And so I think it's important to understand that historical kind of hangover that is still weighing heavily on decision makers in the Kremlin, and also to understand that these are two countries that have really very incompatible interests. The United States has stated objectives in international politics which do not suit the Kremlin. That's why we saw the invasions of 2014 that continued, and then the massive reinvigorated invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. And that's why we see conflict between the United States and Russia in places like Syria and in Africa and elsewhere around the world.
Some have called them the wars of Soviet succession, the use of massive state violence to preserve influence. 2 wars in Chechnya, one prosecuted by Boris Yeltsin long before Vladimir Putin ever came to power.
And I think that's a really important point, that we get really wrapped up in the person of Vladimir Putin. And it's easy to kind of make him the ex-KGB boogeyman. But just like Mikhail Gorbachev probably didn't have much to do with the entire Daniloff episode until it had already happened and he was managing it. Just like the KGB then took, let's call it, independent initiative, so too do a lot of the moving parts of the Russian state apparatus do things by themselves. And I think we get too carried away with this idea of Putin as this puppet master, this master strategist, which at this point is a farcical idea that he's a skilled or even competent strategist, because so much has gone the opposite way of how he would have wished.
If you'd like to learn more about the conversations we're having here on the podcast, sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday morning, you'll get an email from the Washington Times. And coming up on future episodes of History as It Happens, we're going to take a look back at the Paris Peace Accords that helped bring a stage-managed ending to the Vietnam War. And we'll check in again with Anatol Lieven, who went on a reporting trip to Ukraine and wrote a very interesting article in Foreign Policy magazine about Crimea. That and more coming up as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.